Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Toretsk, where the Russians continue breaching the second line of defense of the Ukrainians. The second line of defense of the Ukrainians span from in between the area that is between the two hills here in the east of the Toretsk city. We see that the Russians have breached two parts in the southern parts of it, leaving the current second line of defense spread between the northern hill, where it is connected to several fortified positions, but the southern hill is completely isolated from anywhere else, and Russian positions have cut off the connection between the two. So we see with this breach, the Russians have managed to do two things. First off, they've managed to reach the other side of the second line of defense. And the second thing is that they have managed to cut the connection between the two. The Russians will likely, in this case, focus on this one hill first, while at the same time moving onwards beyond the second line of defense, establishing positions to completely cut off any connections the Ukrainians have with this second hill. We see in the west there is a road connected between the residential area, which are residential vacation homes with a lot of greenery. Here to the south of the hill, the Russians have captured the majority of this dacha area, which is part of Selishne. And with the final parts that will likely fall into Russian control very soon, the Russians would have gained control over any parts beyond that of the forest area. This would lead to the Russians having two areas where they can attend to the fighting by the hill. That would be in the road here to the north, road to the south, and both of them will be able to connect towards the hill from these two directions. We see that the Russians will likely heavily bombard the position, and under the cover of the suppression fire, the Russians will be able to go on top of the hill, and gaining advantage by gaining control over the hill will allow the Russians to overlook the entire forest area, the dacha area here in between Selishne and Toretsk here further north, and generally just a general second line of defense as well, having a position where they can overlook pretty much everything that is in this area, and that would create a massive advantage for the Russians, that they would have real-time overview over the situation, especially if there is some sort of disruption to the communication. They'll still be able to overlook the general area, and they'll be able to forge their plans based on what they see. And it will also allow the Russians to gain a foothold in the forest area, where fighting can start at the same time as they continue pushing in a northern direction towards the second hill here to the north. Gaining control over that will allow the Russians to overlook the entire Pervomaiske and Drushba area, as well as the apartment complex area at the gates to Toretsk. So we see that the Russians, if they gain control over the second line of defense, will have a massive advantage in the area compared to the Ukrainians currently having this massive advantage. Yet the Russians have been able to push through and reach the outskirts of these hills and breach the second line of defense despite this Ukrainian massive advantage. This just shows how much of an advantage the firepower is giving the Russians. Moving on, in the Avdiivka Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have entered Serhivka, and they are fighting at the outskirts of Shelane along the railways. At the same time, the Russians have managed to capture the fortified position of the Ukrainians north of Shelane. This means fighting has reached both Shelane, and a foothold has been achieved in Serhivka. Getting control over Serhane and Serhivka will significantly improve the Russian position in the area. It will allow the Russians to move on to Mykolaiivka, Orelivka, and Novoprodivka here in the south. It will also allow the Russians to gain a significant advantage in the area. This is the topographic map in the area. This is Shelane right here. This is Serhivka right here. And we see that the elevation along the railway is the highest, but the positions within the villages are also very high. There's not much of a height difference. The further away you go from the railways, the lower the elevation is. This is why the Russians are sticking by the railway to keep this height advantage going and moving alongside it. And this is why capturing these two will be very significant for the Russians, as if we look at the positions south of Shelane, we see that the elevation is lower for the Ukrainians, especially the fortified positions along the river line. This will allow the Russians to move with the height advantage down in the southern direction. At the same time, in the northern direction, it will allow the Russians to flank positions such as Orlivka here in the north, which is also at a height disadvantage compared to the Russian positions along the railways. If we take a look, the most important position ahead of Novorodivka and Rodivka is Mykolaiivka and the village chain connected to it in Orlivka, Shurivka, and Krasny Yar. This is very important because the elevation of Mykolaiivka is the highest of all the villages in the area, just a slight advantage, but its position is ahead of Novorodivka and it also connected to Orlivka, Shurivka, Krasny Yar. Gaining control over this village chain will allow the Russians to cut off Novorodivka and Rodivka from each other, at the same time keep this height advantage, especially against Rodivka, which is located at the low ground, compared to Novorodivka, located at the high ground. Therefore, the Russians will look to do two things. The first one is to gain control over the fortified positions east of Rodivka, then make a strong push along the railways to gain control over Mykolaiivka and move on in north direction towards Orlivka, Shuravka, and Krasny Yar. Gain control over those villages will allow the Russians to attack Rodivka from several directions at a semi-encirclement position where there's only one road in and out of Rodivka, and they will be able to target that with direct fire from Krasny Yar, Mykolaiivka, Kruchya, here in between Rodivka and Rodivka. At the same time, with the push along the railway, they will have the height advantage, especially if they capture the fortified positions outside of the fortified positions along Novorodivka. They'll be able to be in a position where they can fight each other from a safe location. The thing is, currently the Russian push is going at a very thin area compared to the wide area we have previously seen. This means that if the Russians continue pushing and reach Novorodivka, even if they capture Rodivka and Novorodivka, will not be in a very wide position. Instead, the Ukrainians would be able to counterattack from the flank and hit them and cut off their supplies, which could lead to an encirclement. Therefore, in such an operation, it is important for the Russians to gain control over the flanks, and this is why Mykolaiivka is extremely important, because it introduces the Russians to the Ukrainian positions in the flank, which would be Selidove here to the south, Mykhailaivka, and generally the road connected to Karelivka. The Russians will need to gain control over this area here to the south if they wish to secure the southern flank. The northern flank is secured by the river line, which is to the south of Vostyshenka. At the same time, the Russians can also push in the direction of Vostyshenka with the southern flank under their control. Therefore, we can see that the current position of the Russians is to gain control over Shelane and Serhivka, move on in a northern direction towards gaining control of Ivanivka, Lysychne, and Srivorodonivka, Novotoretsk, general areas here east of Rodivka and the fortified positions along it. Move on towards Mykolaiivka, Orlivka, Suravka, Krasny Yar, Kruchya, and Mykolaiivka, the village chain to the north of Novorodivka, south of Rodivka, gaining control over Mykolaiivka to the south, to then move in a southern direction towards the flank of Karelivka, cutting off all of the Ukrainian fortified position. At the same time as they are moving along the river line to gain control over the fortified position by attacking it from their flank. All of this to reach the direction of Karelivka from the flank from these two directions, where they'll be moving here along the rear of it, where they'll have the height advantage against Karelivka and the Ukrainian positions along the Vovcha river line and the reservoir. This allows Russians to gain control and connect the two sides, creating a strong flank and starting an operation in the direction of Selidove. All of this while at the same time the Russians are closing in on gaining full control over Krasnodarivka, which will free up a lot of the Russian forces in the area as they'll be moving towards the defensive positions, be able to move along, gaining control over the fortified positions along the gray area here in between the two residential areas. It will become a gray area once the Russians gain control over Krasnodarivka and Nevelske, as there will be a far distance between the fortified positions and the Ukrainian village chain. The Ukrainians will likely withdraw from these positions in the front towards the rear, where they'll be focusing on defending the village chain here west, which is the connection between Karelivka all the way down south to Maximilianivka. So we see that the current development, the current situation all the way north from Novoalexandrivka and down south to Rehorivka is all connected as one entire front. And this as well is connected wider on to the south, where we currently see reports of the Russians starting offensive operations north of Urashine. These offensive operations by the Russians are directed towards Vuhledar. According to Deep State Map, it is an armored assault by the Russians north of Vuhledar to flank the Ukrainian positions by Makarivka, moving towards Vuhledar. Gain control of Vuhledar will significantly improve the Russian positions in the area, but it's also a very wide distance between Vuhledar and Vuhledar, which makes it a very challenging operation. We only have these words from Deep State Map. There's no video evidence so far, or no reports from the Russian side. Therefore, we'll have to wait until there are some sort of results before we can see what happened here. But it is likely going to be a larger assault considering the distance between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. However, it could also just be some simple scouting parties and not an actual offensive. What we're currently seeing is that the Russians are pushing across the entirety of the front line, with the main focus in the Pokrovsk direction, where recent Russian advances are caused by reinforcements that have arrived. According to reports, it is the 27th Russian Division, which some say include Wagner soldiers. I have not seen any confirmation of this, and I don't really have that much information about the 27th Division. I've tried to look for any sort of information, but I've yet to find any. So if you have any information, please let me know. But that is pretty much it for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.